Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about the messages that light up our screens in the dead of night. We're going to explore the quiet hum of a phone on a nightstand, the little dopamine hit of a new notification, and the hope that can bloom from a stranger's perfectly chosen words. It's a space where vulnerability and technology intertwine, where you can build an entire world with someone you've never met. But it's also a place where the floor can drop out from under you without any warning, where a digital courtship can become a real-world cage. You think you know the story, you think you can spot the red flags, but the truth is, when you're the one in the center of it, you might not survive this with your spirit intact. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your city and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a quiet tap on a screen. It centers on a woman named Christina, who was 55 years old and had mastered the art of being alone. She wasn't unhappy, not really, but her life had settled into a rhythm of profound predictability. Her 2 children were grown and gone, living lives of their own, and her days were measured by the clock in and clock out of her retail job. Her evenings were spent in a kitchen that was always a little too tidy, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. It was in that very kitchen, late one evening, that Facebook's ever-knowing algorithm suggested a new contact profile. His name was Kwame. He was 38, lived in Ghana, and his profile picture showed a smile that seemed to radiate genuine warmth, the kind that reached the eyes. Christina, accustomed to the monosyllabic grunts and unsolicited gym selfies of local dating apps, was struck by something else entirely. He wrote incomplete sentences. It was a ridiculously low bar, sure, but after years of digital prospecting, it felt like finding an oasis. She wrote to him a simple, hesitant message and was surprised when he replied almost instantly. In the weeks that followed, their chat became a daily ritual. He asked how she was, what she was doing, and if she felt loved. He was kind, charming, and unfailingly attentive. He was, in her own words, so different from the men she'd known, so different from the weary resignation she'd grown used to. It didn't take long for his messages to become the brightest part of her day. The Facebook Messenger notification was a direct line to a feeling she thought she'd lost. She found herself constantly checking her phone, a slight smile playing on her lips. This is a classic example of what psychologists and people on the internet alike call love bombing. It's an overwhelming display of affection and attention right at the start, designed to make the target feel like they've found their one true soulmate. And for Christina, it was working perfectly. He soon told her she was besonderous, special. He said that age was just a number when 2 hearts understood each other. He called her my queen. He praised her dignity, her aura, her heart. For Christina, who had felt invisible for years, these words were like water in a desert. She was finally being seen. Here's a quirky bit of information for you. This kind of intense text-based intimacy can sometimes feel more real than a physical relationship. When you don't have the person there in front of you, your brain does this funny little thing where it fills in all the blanks with idealized traits. You're not just talking to a person, you're co-creating a fantasy with them, and that can be incredibly powerful. As the old thinkers used to say before they had Wi-Fi, know thyself. But it's a heck of a lot harder to know someone else when they exist only as pixels and prose. A whole 9 months passed like this, a steady stream of digital affection that solidified into a bond Christina believed was unbreakable. She'd sent him small amounts of money here and there, for a supposed phone repair, for a family emergency, but it felt like a small price for the happiness he gave her. So she booked a flight. She was going to Accra. Some of her friends, the few she'd mentioned him to, thought she was out of her mind. Flying halfway across the world to meet a man she'd only ever texted felt like the opening scene of a cautionary tale. But Christina felt it was the most logical thing in the world. She met him on a warm afternoon in the arrivals terminal of Kotoka International Airport, and in that moment, all her doubts evaporated. He was just as he seemed. He took her hand, his touch firm and warm, and looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. The heat of Accra, the vibrant chaos of the city, the scent of spices and exhaust fumes, it all swirled around her in a dizzying, joyous blur. It was exactly as she had hoped. Everything was perfect. Just a few months later, they were married in a small, simple ceremony. Christina felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that she had finally found her new beginning. She was no longer just Christina, the quiet retail worker from Germany. She was a wife, she was a queen, she was loved. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the end of the fairy tale was also the beginning of the nightmare. The man who had taken her hand in the airport was about to show her what happens when love becomes a trap, and when the door to your new life is locked from the inside. The initial weeks after Kwame arrived in Germany felt like an extension of the dream. Christina's quiet, orderly apartment was suddenly filled with a new energy. At first, it was wonderful. She had a partner to cook for, to talk with at the end of the day. He was, as she remembered, friendly, attentive, and sometimes tender in a way that had become completely foreign to her. He'd praise her cooking, even the simple traditional German dishes she'd made for herself for years. He'd ask about her day at the retail store, listening with an intensity that made her feel like the most interesting woman in the world. He would tell her she was a gift to him, his anchor in this new, strange country. After so long in the quiet solitude of her own life, this felt like a healing warmth, a welcome closeness she had thought was lost to her forever. He often spoke of his ambition, his desire to find work and stand on his own 2 feet. He was proud to be here, he said, and eager to contribute. Christina, full of belief in him, became his guide. Together they tackled the beast of German bureaucracy, a monster made of paper and impossible to pronounce words. She patiently explained what a Mietvertrag was, a rental contract, and why the Meldebescheinigung, the proof of residence, was the key that unlocked everything else. Honestly, if you've never tried to explain German administrative processes to a newcomer, you haven't truly experienced a new level of existential dread. It's a process that can make anyone feel small and dependent. She sensed his frustration, the discomfort of a 38-year-old man having to rely so completely on his wife. But she'd smooth it over with reassuring words, thinking it was a temporary phase. She told herself it would all level out once he found a job and his own footing. But it didn't. Instead, something began to curdle. It started subtly, a new sharpness in his words that pricked at the edges of their cozy life. The compliments became backhanded. The attentiveness soured into scrutiny. It began with her appearance. One morning, as she was getting ready for work, he commented on her blouse, saying the color made her look tired. Another day, he criticized the way she spoke on the phone, saying her laugh was too loud. His critiques of her friends were next. He'd ask why she needed to maintain contact with old male friends. Weren't they from her past? Wasn't he her present and future? His jealousy was always framed as concern for their relationship, a joke that stopped being funny the 3rd or 4th time she heard it. This is the textbook beginning of coercive control, which isn't about a single act of violence, but a strategic campaign of behaviors over time designed to isolate, degrade, and ultimately dominate a person. At first, these were just harmless remarks, easily dismissed. Christina would laugh them off, or change the subject, or tell herself it was just the stress of his situation. This is a common phenomenon, sometimes called adjustment disorder, or just the plain old foreigner's blues. The immense psychological pressure of adapting to a new culture can make people irritable and insecure. She saw his behavior through that compassionate lens. He was struggling. and it was her job as his wife to be patient. But the remarks soon morphed into accusations. If she shared a story about her day with a friend, he would accuse her of being disloyal, of talking about him behind his back. He insisted that other people wanted to influence her, to turn her against him. A wise woman from the 19th century once noted that a cage of silk is still a cage. Christina's was being woven thread by thread with words of love and concern, and so she began to change. She told her friends less, she cut her phone calls short, she stifled her laugh when he was in the room. The space she occupied in her own home began to shrink. The first major escalation came over technology. It started with her phone, which he began checking regularly. Then he wanted her passwords for her email and her online banking. Christina, for the first time, said no. But it was a hesitant no, a cautious one. Kwame didn't get loud. He didn't have to. His face changed, his warm eyes growing cold and flat. He told her that trust had to be mutual. He said he would never feel the need to check on her if she had nothing to hide. And besides, they were a married couple. A couple shares everything. His logic was twisted, but it was presented so calmly, so reasonably, that it almost made sense. She felt a hot flush of shame for her own mistrust. So she gave in. She gave him all the passwords. In a rare conversation with a friend, she let it slip, mentioning for the first time that Kwame could be a bit strange sometimes, that she felt controlled. The friend immediately said that wasn't normal. But Christina quickly backpedaled, laughing it off and saying it was just a phase, that she was probably just imagining things. She was trying to convince herself as much as her friend. But in the quiet moments, when Kwame was out, she would think of the time before he arrived. She remembered how calm and secure she had felt. That feeling was now a distant memory. The golden leash was tightening. He wasn't just her husband anymore. He was her gatekeeper. He managed her social life by proxy, approved of her conversations, and held the keys to her digital world. She had flown to him seeking a new beginning, a life filled with love and companionship, and she'd found it for a time. But now, standing in the middle of her own living room, she was beginning to understand that the price of her queenhood was her freedom. The door to her apartment could still be opened, she could still technically leave, but she was already a prisoner. She just didn't know how literal that was about to become. One evening, after she came home from work, the air in the apartment felt different, tense. He asked where she'd been. She said she'd just been grocery shopping and took a short walk to get some fresh air. He stood in front of her, blocking her path to the kitchen, and said quietly that he didn't believe her. Then he stepped aside and let her pass. As she walked by, he slammed the apartment door shut, and with a deliberateness that froze her blood, he locked it. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was a sound of finality. That was the first time she knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer free. But that was only the beginning. Christina had never seen herself as someone who gives in. She had raised 2 children on her own, waking at 5 in the morning for cleaning jobs before landing in retail, where she toughed it out year after year. She was reliable, mentally strong. And yet, the woman she saw in the mirror each morning was a stranger, her eyes holding a fear she didn't recognize. The first blue flecks appeared on her arm. She explained them away to herself, a clumsy bump against a door frame, an awkward movement while carrying groceries. Maybe she hadn't realized how hard he'd grabbed her arm when she didn't answer him right away. Maybe it wasn't intentional. The thought that she was actively constructing these excuses for him only occurred to her much later. When she did mention a bruise, Kwame's response was a masterclass in what we now call gaslighting. He'd say she was exaggerating. He hadn't hurt her. It was just a reflex. She needed to stop being so sensitive. And when his denials were met with her silence, he would flip the script. Her silence hurt him. She had grown cold. She was provoking him intentionally. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. No matter what she did, it was the wrong thing. There's an old mariner's saying, "The sea does not reward those who are too anxious, too greedy, or too impatient." But the sea, unlike some people, doesn't actively try to drown you while convincing you it's your fault you can't breathe. The verbal abuse became a constant humming backdrop to her life. He started calling her old, telling her that no one else would ever be interested in her, that she should be grateful that someone like him, young and vital, would even want her. Sometimes he'd say this from the couch while she was in the kitchen preparing their dinner, and silent tears would stream down her face, falling onto the vegetables she was chopping. She felt like a shadow of herself. The money in her bank account, meanwhile, was steadily dwindling. It wasn't a sudden large withdrawal, but a slow bleed. A purchase from an online store here, a wire transfer overseas there. Since he had access, he told her he was only taking what he was entitled to. After all, he had nothing and she was his wife. It was her duty to provide. That's always the fun part of those trust exercises, isn't it? The trust so often flows in only one direction. She stopped checking her bank statements. The last time she'd questioned him about a transfer, the discussion had ended with him grabbing her by the wrists, his grip like iron shaking her as he screamed, asking if she was really accusing him of using her. She didn't talk to anyone anymore. Her friends stopped calling after being rebuffed too many times. When her daughter called and asked if everything was okay, Christina would force a smile into her voice. She'd say yes, of course, and then explain that Kwame was just having some trouble adjusting. The lie sounded plausible, even to her own ears. It was easier than the truth. But a part of her, the strong woman who had raised 2 kids alone, knew this couldn't go on. The thought of escape began as a whisper and grew into a plan. She discreetly called a friend, making careful allusions, and the friend's advice was stark. Pack a bag and go, before something terrible happens. Christina took the warning to heart. She secretly packed a small bag and hid it in the back of her closet. She planned to leave on a Monday morning to just walk out and never return. The key was ready. Her phone was charged. She had cash tucked away, but he sensed it. Maybe it was a look in her eye, a nervousness she couldn't hide. The night before she planned to leave, he stood over their bed and asked why she was so agitated. Did she want to run away? She said nothing. Her silence was the only answer he needed. In one fluid motion, he snatched her phone from the nightstand, walked to the front door, turned the key in the lock twice, and pocketed it. He said nothing. He simply went into the living room and turned off the light, plunging the apartment into a tense, listening darkness. The silent treatment is always a classic, but it's so much more effective when paired with a deadbolt. She was now officially a prisoner. The following days blurred into a fog. It wasn't a loud, screaming terror, but a cold, systematic lockdown. He would bring her food and tea, and each time he would ask if she was going to drink at all. It took her a while to understand why she felt so dizzy after some cups, why her limbs were so heavy, why she would suddenly fall asleep in the middle of the day. She remembered a small, unlabeled brown bottle in the kitchen. He told her it was just for the restlessness. You need rest. He presented it as care. She understood it was control. This is a terrifying aspect of abuse, a phenomenon known as learned helplessness. After repeated trauma, you can't escape. You can lose the will to even try. Your world shrinks to the size of your cage. For some abusers, it seems they all get an honorary PhD in amateur pharmacology, knowing just what to use to keep their victims docile and confused. One day, as she was crying, he sat next to her, placing a hand on her back. "Be still," he murmured almost tenderly, as he handed her another cup of tea. In that moment, she knew if she didn't fight, she would eventually just fall silent forever. On the 3rd day of her imprisonment, Christina heard the shower running. The bathroom door was ajar. Hope, or maybe just pure survival instinct, flickered in her chest. She crept to the apartment's front door, her hands searching for a key that wasn't there. She pressed her face to the cool wood, rattling the letterbox slot, and whispering for help into the empty hallway, but no one answered. Her breath was shallow, her thoughts racing. She pushed herself off the door and stumbled back towards the kitchen, and that's when she realized she was holding a knife. She didn't remember picking it up from the counter block. Her fingers were wrapped so tightly around the handle it felt like an extension of her own arm, the last piece of control she had left in the world. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." Of course, Epictetus probably never had to make that choice while someone was slipping tranquilizers into his chamomile tea. Her mind fractured into two stark choices: get out or disappear. Seconds stretched into minutes. The sound of the shower was a steady, indifferent hiss. She was frozen, a statue of terror in her own kitchen. Then, as if waking from a trance, she moved back to the sink and set the knife down, her hands trembling violently. As she leaned against the counter, she felt a sharp, burning pain in her forearm, a deep scratch, maybe from the knife, maybe from the sharp edge of the sink. She barely registered it, only watched as blood began to slowly seep into the fabric of her sleeve. And when she turned, he was standing there, framed in the doorway, dripping wet, with a towel around his hips. His eyes were unreadable. He saw her. He saw the knife on the counter. He saw the spreading stain on her sleeve. And he said nothing. He simply turned around and closed the kitchen door, the click of the latch locking her in. Meanwhile, in the apartment directly above, a man named Mr. Schmidt was growing uneasy. He was a widower in his mid-60s, a man of routine and quiet observation. He and Christina had exchanged polite greetings in the stairwell, but nothing more. Yet he noticed things. For 4 days her windows had been dark, the curtains drawn. There had been no garbage bag set outside her door in the morning, a small ritual he'd become accustomed to seeing. He heard no voices, just saw the occasional shadow move behind the curtains, a shadow that didn't seem to have Christina's shape. He was concerned, but he was also hesitant. This is where that psychological phenomenon known as the bystander effect often kicks in, a situation where people are less likely to help when confronted with ambiguity. He didn't want to meddle, and there was another layer. It was a binational marriage. What if he called someone and it was just a cultural misunderstanding? The last thing he wanted was to be labeled a racist old man for interfering in a young couple's life. Better to say nothing. But on the 4th night, something shifted. He heard voices from below, muffled but hard. Then a long, deep silence that felt heavier than before. It gnawed at him. He stood in his own hallway listening before retreating into his apartment, leaving his door slightly ajar. And in the dead of that night, he heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was perfectly clear. A single word, whispered from a place of utter desperation. "Hilfa!" Help! The next morning his resolve solidified. He went downstairs and stood before her door listening. Nothing. He rang the bell, no answer. He rang it again, longer this time. Silence. He went back upstairs, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and duty, and he picked up the phone. He dialed 110. When the police arrived, Mr. Schmidt was still worried he was overreacting. But after hearing his account, the officers' faces grew grim. Their repeated loud knocking and calls to open up were met with the same silence Mr. Schmidt had encountered. A decision was made. With a sickening crack of splintering wood, they broke the door down. The sudden explosion of sound, of loud, authoritative voices, was an alien thing in the drugged quiet of the apartment. 2 officers stormed in. A moment later, Christina stumbled barefoot out of the kitchen. The sleeves of her sweater were dark and stiff with dried blood. She raised her hands slightly as if to surrender, to say, "I'm only me." Kwame was in the living room. For a second he was motionless, a look of shock on his face. Then he started shouting. It was a torrent of words, a desperate attempt to regain control, but it was a jumble of broken German, English, and "Why? One of the officers moved on him immediately, ordering him to sit down. He didn't resist physically, but the stream of frantic explanations and accusations never stopped. It was probably the most communicative he'd been in days. A real shame nobody could follow what he was saying. As Christina was guided past him towards the broken open door in the light of the hallway, Kwame fell silent. His eyes followed her, cold and intense, but for the first time in a very long time, his gaze had no power over her. In that moment she knew. She was the one who was leaving, not him. The lock and the key no longer mattered. Christina's memory of the ambulance ride was a kaleidoscope of flashing blue lights and the muffled feeling of someone holding her hand. The hospital was a shock to her sedated system. Too bright, too loud, too clean. A doctor with a calm voice asked her questions about pain and allergies, and Christina answered with quiet nods, her body feeling dull and heavy, as if it didn't quite belong to her anymore. The physical examination was a clinical catalogue of her secret pain. The report documented what she had spent weeks trying to ignore: contusions on her upper arms, her hip, her ribs, and her blood work told the rest of the story, revealing traces of sedatives that couldn't be explained by any prescription. They were the chemical signature of her captivity. The doctor told her, with a kindness that almost broke her, that this happens more often than people think. Christina looked at the woman who had just documented her trauma and asked if a person can survive something like this. The doctor paused for a moment before replying, "You have." Later, a psychologist came to her room, introduced herself, and simply said she was there to listen. For a long time, Christina said nothing, but as the afternoon light faded outside her window, a single sentence fell out of her. "I don't know how I got into this." It wasn't a confession. It was a simple, stark statement of fact. This feeling is a hallmark of moral injury, a deep sense of transgression against one's own values, not just for what was done to you, but for what you feel you allowed to happen. The police came the next day. They were polite, patient. One of them wrote everything down as Christina tried to piece together the timeline. But her memory was a fog. She remembered smells, the cloying sweetness of the doctored tea. She remembered sounds, the definitive click of the deadbolt. But dates and sequences were lost to her. "It was like a film," she told them, "except I wasn't the main character." The officer wrote that down verbatim. It was perhaps the first time in a long while that her words were taken as truth without question or manipulation. An advocate from a victim support service visited, offering her a place in a women's shelter. Christina declined, not out of pride, but because the thought of being around other people was unbearable. She just wanted a room where she could breathe without anyone asking her where she was going. The full truth, however, was yet to be revealed. The police, during their investigation, had found a folder on Kwame's laptop. The folder was labeled with her name, Christina. Inside, they found dozens of screenshots from dating websites, but the profiles weren't of women he was talking to. They were profiles he had created. He had used Christina's photos, her story of being a lonely older woman, to impersonate her. He was catfishing other men, spinning tales of financial hardship and asking for money, all while using her face and her name. She wasn't just his victim, she was the unwilling bait for his next scam. Discovering your husband was secretly using your identity to romance other people is a level of betrayal so specific, there isn't even a good Netflix category for it yet. When an officer gently explained this to her in a small sterile room at the clinic, Christina stared into the empty space in front of her. The 17th century philosopher John Locke wrote that personal identity depends on consciousness. But what happens when your consciousness has been clouded and your identity has been stolen and used as a tool? Christina took a deep breath and whispered, "Not even my name belongs to me anymore." A few weeks later, the verdict came in. Christina didn't attend the hearing. She couldn't bear to be in the same room as him, to hear lawyers try to fit her experience into legal paragraphs. Kwame was found guilty. His sentence: 2 years of probation, a monetary fine, and a list of court-mandated conditions. For some, this might sound like justice. For others, it's a slap in the face. It's the kind of outcome that can lead to something researchers call post-traumatic embitterment disorder, a lasting feeling of being wronged by an unjust world. Christina packed 3 boxes and 2 bags. She left almost everything else behind: the furniture, the kitchenware, even an old coffee pot she had once cherished. She moved to a new city, to an anonymous ground-floor apartment with a small balcony. No one greeted her in the hallway, no one asked any questions, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She was suffocated by a profound sense of shame. She didn't answer messages from her friends. When her children reached out, offering to talk, she read their texts and then turned her phone off for days. She wasn't ready to explain herself. She just wanted quiet. But in the silence of her new life, everything echoed. The story of Christina and Kwame is, in many ways, over. But for Christina, it continues every day. And this leaves us with a question. What do you think? Was that justice? Is a system of fines and probation enough to protect the victims of this kind of intimate terror? Or do we, as a society, need a new and deeper understanding of psychological violence and the scars it leaves behind? And so we arrive at the end of our story for tonight, having walked alongside Christina through the dizzying promises of a new love and into the suffocating silence of a prison she never saw being built around her. These narratives are not merely tales of caution. They are intimate windows into the profound resilience of the human spirit, but also into its heartbreaking fragility when placed under the immense pressure of calculated cruelty. It is easy to sit on the outside and believe we would have seen the signs, that we would have been stronger, that we would have left sooner, but the truth is that the most effective traps are the ones we do not recognize until the door has already been locked behind us. As the echoes of Christina's journey begin to soften, allow yourself to return to the quiet of your own space, to the gentle hum of the fan and the familiar weight of the air around you. May we all carry a piece of her story with us, not as a weight of fear, but as a light of empathy, reminding us to listen a little more closely to the silences of those around us, to trust our instincts, and to extend kindness without reservation, both to others and, most importantly, to ourselves. Thank you for sharing this space with me tonight. Sleep well and be good to yourselves.